Everybody's at the end.
All right.
Maybe this new one is different than what we did. I don't know.
Email Steve one?
Red is for Gary. Oh, we've already done.
Alright, does that make sense to everybody? Make sense to everybody over here? So we're gonna continue on with Solomon, the first 11 chapters, pretty much to where Rehoboam and the divided kingdom starts taking place. And rather than trying to find more and more to talk about and reviewing over and over again, but that'll keep the story going and go to a good quitting point with the divided kingdom and see how the story carries out. So we'll plan on doing that. Any questions?
I know you get questions with the answers already filled in.
There's no book. There's no questions. So you're going to have to use the one and only book that really matters, right? So gives you more chance to study, focus on the Bible, and read that. And I'm sure you've done some previous studies on First Kings before, so it'd be a good opportunity to review that also. Before we begin, I'm going to ask John Slide Lewis in a word of prayer, please.
Let's pray together. Father, we thank you again for our privilege and our opportunity to gather together this morning to worship and study together. We pray that you'd be with us, especially as Carrie leads our class, that the things that we study first may be true, and second, that we may see the way that we can use that to improve ourselves as servants of yours. As we study about David and his family, help us to learn lessons from others that we don't have to go through those experiences ourselves, and use that to help others. We're mindful, Lord, of many who need our prayers, but we're also mindful of many prayers that have been answered, for those that we continue to think of, and we thank you for that, and we praise you for that. We pray that you would continue to be with us, help us to worship in spirit and in truth. In Christ's name we pray.
All right, appreciate that in prayer, and especially the part where we talk about how this applies to not just a history lesson and a study of history, but how do we apply that to our lives today? And when I read through this and study it, that's one of the things I always try to do is how does that relate and what kind of lessons learned can we get from these stories? So we're in lesson 16, and it's actually 15 through 17. I put 15 through 16 here, but it's actually 15 through 17. I was not here on Wednesday, and I couldn't get the streaming to work. So how did it go on Wednesday? Any good questions on chapters 13 and 14? That was the story about Amnon and Tamar. Their half-brother, half-sister. He ends up raping her, right? And Absalom murders Amnon.
You answered every question.
Good. And Absalom flees to Geshur. Remember all this? And then at the very end, he ends up returning to Jerusalem and to his father David, right? They reunite, right? Or does he? Yeah. So it doesn't seem like a very genuine reunion because immediately we see what happens after that in our study today. So we'll got into chapter 15. So if Gary answered all your questions, then we'll press on.
One thing we observed on Wednesday was that, or I think anyway, that Absalom viewed his father as weak as a king at this time. First of all, because he didn't punish Amnon, and then here at the end of chapter 14, he says, "Therefore, let me go into the presence of the king. If there's guilt in me, let him put me to death." Almost sounds like he didn't believe he would do it because he was weak. So that was his opportunity to overthrow his father.
Right. So we see that Absalom has very little respect for his father, and to the point of obviously contempt and wanting to overthrow David's kingdom. So we get into chapter 15, the very end of 14. I'll read that verse. Joab went to king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. So that's the reunion there. That well, maybe if you stop right there, you think, well, maybe things work out and they get reunited, things go well. But we see here immediately in chapter 15, it says that after Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him, and Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And he would say, "Your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel." And Absalom would say, "See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you." And Absalom would say, "Oh, there I would judge in the land. If I were the judge in the land, that every man with dispute or cause might cause me to come to me, and I would give him justice." So what is Absalom doing here?
Politics.
Yeah, politics. Yeah.
Kind of fits the season, doesn't it?
Yeah. And as I put on the slide here, he's working the crowd, right? And he's saying, and he's very active, very proactive about this. I mean, every single day he's going to the gate where all the people come in to see the king and get judgment and have issues, and he's talking to them and getting their ear before they have a chance to go to the king, right? And they all know, this is the king's son, so that I think they probably feel like, he has some kind of authority and some kind of power, being the king's son. And if we get down to verse 6, he says, Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So he 4 years of this had eventually had taken place of this politicking, then that he actually ended up stealing the hearts of many of the men of Israel. And we have this conspiracy or a coup that grows so strong that there's so many followers now that Absalom is able to act upon it.
Terry,
Yes.
it's funny because that is politicking at its finest, but we see that works throughout history in every season, right? Works at church, oh, if I was your boss. It works in relationships, oh, if I was your man or if I was your woman. It works in the church, oh, if I was this individual, I would have had. That's just the way people are, right? And the answer to that is lies, because whenever people are in that, they then understand the rest of the story and they realize, oh, when I become a parent, I'm going to do this. Everybody has probably said that, and then they become a parent and they realize how wise their parents really were, right? Because when you get the reality of life, you do as others did before you, because there's a lot more wisdom in it.
We're always looking for the better thing and think that, the phrase of the grass is always greener on the other side. Well, it's not always greener, and we're always looking for something better, and it's not always better. So how does David react? He finds out about this, right? Somebody delivers a message to him. And what does the messenger say?
He flees.
Okay, why does he flee? He flees Jerusalem after he's told about this.
He had his head stuck in the sand for so long, not paying attention to what was going on. He didn't realize how big it had gotten.
Right, yeah.
And he was
To
protecting
preserve
his family.
Jerusalem and the lives of people, including his son.
Okay.
So he fled to keep from having a military confrontation, it seems to me.
Yeah, I agree. In verse 14 it says, "Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly and bring down ruin on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." So he's worried about the city. He's worried about the people of the city, and like she said, it was a point where this was, it kind of snuck up on him because after all these years, it took a messenger to come to him to say how bad it had actually gotten. So I'm not really sure how much he really knew at this point, but he leaves with his entourage in haste. He leaves behind some people. Who does he leave behind? Yeah, 10 concubines. It's kind of interesting because I think he kind of assumes that they would be left alone because they're Israelites, and it's against, you know, it would be against the law of Moses for them to do anything to these concubines, based on the law of Moses. So he thought probably Absalom would leave them alone, but we find out that's not the case. So as David flees Jerusalem, what's the scene here? They're at the in the middle of chapter 15.
Seems like a group of people hurrying out of the city.
Yeah.
He has some fighting men with him, the ones that have been with him a long time.
And he also has some mercenaries with him,
a lot
right?
of
From other
others,
countries and other places that are there standing by him.
Well, those were probably his bodyguards. Not unusual for kings to hire mercenaries as bodyguards because they had no political.
Right. Then they can be gained by it.
Yeah.
We see an example here in verse 19, Ittai, the Gittite, and asks him, you know, why are you coming with me? And he says, you know, you can go back, but he says, no, I'm going to stay with you. And so it's kind of a line going past him, and he's reviewing all the people that are leaving with him. It says in verse 23, and all the land wept aloud as all the people passed by, and the king crossed the brook Kidron, and all the people passed on towards the wilderness. We have I got a map up here that shows Absalom. He's going to go down here to Hebron to form his coup, and then David escapes from Jerusalem, going up towards Gilgal, and then he's going to rest at the Jordan, and then continue on up that we see here in the next couple of chapters.
You know, I was thinking as you were reading about his son Absalom and David leaving, it's interesting because in Galatians we get this verbiage the same way we do in 1 Corinthians, where he says, don't you know, basically that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? That's what you're saying here, right? When you don't address something early and you let it fester, now look, you have a city. David has to make a decision so that the city, because I think that makes practical sense, right? So that they don't have everybody turning against each other. But if this would have got addressed from the gate, then it went all the way to the left. Because now it's in a place where there's nothing good that's going to come from this. But if it could have got addressed quickly, before it got ugly and big, it would have been a different scenario. And I think that is wisdom of God. To say, hey, whenever you have a little leaven, purge that thing out from among you so it doesn't go off of what we see here.
Yeah, that Absalom for 4 years should have been allowed to be stealing the hearts of men, right? David wasn't paying attention to what was going on here.
Like many of us have adult children, we don't always agree with the things we do, but they do, but we always have hope.
Right.
That they'll do the right thing. And I think David looked at his sons that way too. Even though Absalom conspired and rebelled against him, he still loved him. That passage you read at the end of chapter 14 basically shows that David loved Absalom. You don't see the return of that.
Yeah, we're going to see that he mourned from Absalom after this is all over too, right? So there's a lot of mourning going on. Yes.
I think this after God's own heart theme kind of ties in with David because he was after God's own heart too. He lived after God's own heart. He loved it deeply. He loved his family deeply.
Right.
And I think that's one of the characteristics of God. He loves his family deeply.
Yeah, which also makes me wonder, though, I try to get in the head of Absalom. You know, did he not see the future of this? What was going to happen? His own brothers killing each other, fighting against David. He had potential to become king even after David died. Did he not? To be an heir to the throne. So why did he feel it necessary to do this? You know, just kind of wonder how he was tempted. I mean, obviously, I think there was some narcissism going on and some very much arrogance, I guess, on his part. But it's just interesting. I tried to get in his head and go, why would you feel that?
Well, it all boils down to the consequences of all the actions that happened. Multiple wives, multiple sons, and and David's transgressions. That he was warned about all this is going to happen, right, with his family. It talks about his all the things that were going to happen. A lot of this is coming true now that had been foreseen earlier. When we get to chapter verse 24, we see where the Ark of the Covenant had been brought out of the city and up to David. Remember these priests, Abiathar and Zadok, had come up the ark and they set it down and said, we brought it for you. And verse 25 says, the king said to Zadok, carry the ark of God back to the city. And then he explains to him why he doesn't want it with him. He says, if I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see both it and the dwelling place. So he's basically saying, if God will, that I go back to Jerusalem, I'll be with the ark then, and not necessarily need to. I think there was a sense of permanency if he took it with him and they left the city. Yes, Cindy?
I guess, yeah, I'm seeing that even though David was a man after God's own heart, he made a lot of poor choices. And so I guess that's the warning to us. We can have a heart after God, we can make some bad choices and take our ease. And I feel like David, up until this point, was just kind of sitting back and resting on his laurels instead of being the king that Israel needed.
Yeah. So we're in that part where we had the king's decline, right? Remember we had the ascendancy, and then now he's on this decline. Now where he's losing control of his family and his kingdom and the power that he has over Israel.
He put it in God's hands, so he said, but he said, I have no pleasure in you. Oh, here I am. So he leaves it with God.
Right, yeah.
Hey, and Carrie, I was gonna say, if you look at the beautifulness of the whole thing, that's not a word, I made it up. But if you look at the beautifulness of the whole entire thing of David, is that even though he was good and he had bad, but he still always consulted and went to God. He always did. When there was trouble or something was going on, he still went to God, and God was still merciful to him. And when you think about that, how many times are we not David, where we do stupid things and whatever, but God still accepts us and loves us even through all of it. And David still, in this verse, talks about how he goes to God. And
but he still had his slip-ups. Remember when the ark was first removed? Was being moved to Jerusalem. That he hadn't consulted God, and then he rushed into that. So
always is too far. He usually went
yeah,
to God.
but most of the time he did, and when he did, obviously, and when he did, it was successful. When he didn't, we find out the consequences.
And it's the same thing with us. We're no better.
Right.
We're no better. We do the same thing, and God still takes us in and says, you know what? I forgive you, and I'm going to help you. He does it all the time.
And I think that goes to Cindy's point, though. I think what Cindy drove on was we can have the right heart, but make the wrong decisions. And that's very important for us to understand. And so what happens when we get the whipping from God? Do we change our decision-making process, or do we remain going down that path? I think that's the ultimate lesson for us. Right heart doesn't mean you make the right decisions. When you get the whooping, do you start making the right decisions to turn back to God, or you stay stubborn and go down the wrong path?
Exactly.
And I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much about David in the scriptures, because that's us. I mean, and David repented, and that's the lesson for us. God will forgive what we've done as long as we repent.
I think I've learned in my longer age that I go to God when things are trialsome, going through struggles. But I think I've seen we get in more trouble when things are going what we think is evil. Are we going to God when things are smooth and easy? Because that's where it's so easy to step off.
Anytime you think things are well off and things are really going good, it doesn't take very long before something humbles you, right? Slaps you in the face.
David may have even questioned in his mind whether this rebellion of Absalom was an act of God, and he refused to fight against it because
He kind of hints towards it's a punishment towards him, right? And that
even
he deserved it.
the guy starts throwing rocks at him, he questions if he's not speaking from God. So
Yeah. We'll talk about that here in the next
he's
chapter.
confused at the moment and watching things play out to see how they work and what God's will is.
Right. So the rest of the chapter 15 here, we have, he sends the priest back with the ark into the city, and he tells them to, just keep their ear to the ground, right? And he also sends back his friend Hushai, the Archite, and tells him to go back to the city and to basically be a spy for him, right? He enlists him to listen up and there to use Zadok's son and Abiathar's sons to come back as messengers if there was anything going on. So we see those two men in the chapter 15. Their name is Ahimaaz and Jonathan, not to be confused with the other Jonathan. But these two were to be messengers. The priest's son were to be messengers to come back, but Hushai was there to try to help out David what he could, basically as a spy for David. And then we go into chapter 16, and we find a little bit about Ziba. Who's Ziba?
Mephibosheth's guardian.
Yeah, right. Remember, and he was one of the servants of the house of Saul, and David had gone to Ziba because he wanted to bless Jonathan's son with Mephibosheth, right here, right? So he wanted to.
We'll go with your version.
Okay. Ziba brought provisions to David because they had left pretty quickly, so they didn't have a lot of time to prepare. So he brings them some provisions, and right away David asked, where is Mephibosheth? And Ziba, what does Ziba say?
He wanted to stay there because he thought maybe he'd be king there.
Okay, well, it says that he'd give me back the kingdom of my father, right? Yeah. Is that totally true?
He thought that or not?
Yeah.
You wouldn't think so.
It doesn't appear to be so. That there might have been some exaggeration or some trying to get into favor with David, but we see as a result of saying that, nonetheless, that he says, "Behold, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." And Ziba said, "I pay homage. Let me ever find favor in your sight, my lord the king." So he gives David gives him all of the stuff that he had given to Jonathan's son, and so Ziba, and we'll see that later on, what occurs with that. And then we get to the part that John mentioned too about Shimei. This is a man that's out there cursing David. In verses 5 through 14, we see that there's a man standing on the hillside, and they're all passing by, and that he starts taunting them, throwing rocks, and which I thought was a pretty bold move, considering this was the king of Israel, and all the bodyguards and the soldiers that were with him, and that he's doing this. But we see people do some pretty foolish things, right? Even in the face of danger. And how does David react to this taunting?
So let him alone, it might be from God.
Right, yeah. So this is where we're still seeing that David is talking about that. This is this may be part of his punishment. It may be from the consequence of what he's been doing, and leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. So,
but he does get his name on the list, David's list of people to be dealt with after his death, because he mentions him to Solomon, as he does Joab also.
right,
He also says, "My own son seeks my life. How much more this guy?"
right, yeah, it's like, yeah. And then we see that in verse 14 says, "The king and all the people who were with him arrived weary at the Jordan, and there he refreshed himself." So now they've reached the Jordan River. They're going to cross the river and head up to the northeast. And then we get into the part here in chapter 16 where Absalom is entering Jerusalem. It says, somebody read verses 15 through 19, if you could.
Meanwhile, Absalom and all of say it for me.
Ahithophel.
Ahithophel was with him. And so it was when Hushai, the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, that Hushai said to Absalom, "Long live the king, long live the king." So Absalom said to Hushai, "Is this your loyalty to your friend? Why did you not go with your friend?" And Hushai said to Absalom, "No, but whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel choose, his I will be, and with him I will remain. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve in the presence of his son? As I have served in your father's presence, so will I be in your presence." Then Absalom said to give advice as to who should do, and said to Absalom, "Go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you are abhorred by your father."
That's good
Abhorred
there.
by your
We'll
father.
stop there.
Stop.
Yep. So Absalom, they're back. They're in Jerusalem now, and who is this Ahithophel? Yeah, David's counselor. This used to be David's counselor, and was a close, friend of his, and gave him a lot of advice over the years. But he has now started following after Absalom, and we have Hushai has gone back to Jerusalem per David's command. Remember, as a spy. And what does Hushai do? He's able to convince Absalom, right, that he's here to serve him, do the will of God. That's the will of God, and he's a little ambiguous at first when he says, I'm going to follow who God's will is, and but we know that he's there really to serve the purposes of David. Through the advice of Ahithophel, we see that he tells him he should take the 10 concubines. And what does he do in taking the concubines?
Put them on public display.
Yeah, they pitch a tent on the roof, and all the people know that he's basically going to sleep with all these concubines in front of the whole city. And that was one of the prophecies, right? That we had seen that, remember, David had done things in secret, but a lot of the things that were going to happen in public. And so we see some of that coming true there. And that's against the law. That was against the law for them to do, for him to do that in this case.
It was also a public slide that David was changed hands.
Right. He Absalom's using it to show his power, and that that he's the king, and people are going to do what he says.
And it's a public right with David also. This violation would be a violation of David's sovereignty as king.
Right. All right. That leads us to chapter 17, which is where Hushai saves David. Let's read. I'll read the first couple of verses here. It says, "Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, 'Let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged, and throw him into a panic, and all the people who were with him will flee.'" So we're seeing more advice to Absalom by David's former counselor about wanting to attack David, get it over with, and Absalom thought that seemed pretty good advice at first, but then he decides he wants to consult Hushai. What is Hushai? How does he react?
He said it wasn't good.
And why does he say it's not good?
Risky.
Okay.
Because David's men will fight hard, and if there's any loss of lives, it will reflect badly on Absalom and his leadership.
Right. So we see that he used a lot of emotional type in his argument. He says, they're mighty men. He says, like a bear robbed of her cubs. Your father is an expert in war. He won't spend the night with the people. He'll be in hiding. So all these things he's doing to try to convince Absalom not to attack. Because why? Because his allegiance is to David, right? So he doesn't want, he wants to be able to at least warn David ahead of time before he gets attacked.
So part of it's the urgency, because Ahithophel wanted to go tonight
Right.
with 12,000, get them while they're weak, tired, and so just the bad counsel said, let's wait, let's get more people, you need to lead it, so that David can get more prepared for it. It's all he wanted to do was one little thing to put one little thing in there that's going to mess up Ahithophel's counsel.
Right. And Ahithophel's counsel is pretty good because David is low on provisions. They've been traveling this whole time, and it probably would have been very successful. But we see the work, the hand of God, in here again, where Hushai had been sent from David and was able to actually be effective. Because whose counsel does Absalom take? Yeah, Hushai. He says in verse 14 that the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. How does Ahithophel take that when he finds out? Yeah, rather poorly, right? Yeah, he says in verse 21. No, it's in verse 23. He saw the counsel was not followed. His counsel was not followed. He saddled his donkey, went off home to his own city. He set his house in order and hanged himself, and he died. So he took it pretty hard that that it wasn't gonna. His advice hadn't been taken, and that he realized where his place was in Absalom's kingdom. I think.
Hey, Gary.
Yes.
What's crazy about this is you see God using sinners to punish sin, and then He's going to punish the sinners.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the whole way, because He did it with the Chaldeans, back with His people. You just watch God. God uses anything at His disposal, and in the end, all sin is still getting punished. Regardless if it's His people or people who are not His people, He's punishing sin left and right, and He's doing it in a very masterful way. It's so interesting.
Because technically, that's not enough to kill yourself just because someone told you they didn't take your advice. A lot of people don't take your advice. That doesn't mean you hang yourself and kill yourself.
Yeah, there could have been a lot more going on that we're not told about on how it transpired.
The latter part of verse 14 says, "For the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom." So God's working in all this to work out an end, isn't He?
Right.
It's interesting to me, how would I respond as an Israelite? Somebody who lived in Hebrew or Dan or Beersheba. You got David he's killed Goliath. He has this great history of serving God. You have times of peace under David's reign. He's not dead, and yet Absalom, it just seems like the kingdom flip-flops pretty quickly, because after Absalom dies, they're right back in David's camp almost. So I just kind of wonder how the undercurrent within Israel from top to bottom, how that flowed, and kind of how, the information, how I would respond to that. And I don't know, it just seems interesting to me.
It doesn't take long for us as human beings to forget the past and what has happened. When we look at our own country, how quickly we forget things. And, we say we never forget, but we do forget, and things can change very quickly. I think this is the same way. People, they forget these things, and it's all an they consider it ancient history. Something that happened 20, 30, 40 years ago, and press on and think there's better things that can happen. So
Grass is greener on the other side, and this guy is promising them more, or what they think is more than
better
what they're
judgment.
getting. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, the hand of God is in all this too, because there's indications, and you probably cover when you get to 1 Kings, that God had actually selected Solomon as David's successor, so that all these older brothers like Amnon, Absalom, and even Adonijah would have been problems for Solomon. What God's working out is eliminating
Make it easier, right? So Hushai, Cindy, did you have a comment?
Well, thinking like Rob's thinking, maybe, sorry, Rob. You know, we're all individually responsible for doing the right thing, but sometimes that's hard when those around us and even those seem to have the leadership. I mean, you can imagine the Israelites going, what's going on? We're God's people, and yet our leaders are not doing the right thing, you know? I mean, and I think of Elijah when he went, I'm all alone, and God said, no, there's a lot more prophets there. But, you know, we all have this, and we all have to take some responsibility.
And one good thing about Ahithophel, you know, he made a choice to go with Absalom, and he gave advice. He was still giving good advice. He said he was giving good advice, but then we had I forgot his name. He was trying to confound that advice. So when he realizes that he's not going to listen to him, you know, he sets his house in order. You got to think. Do you think that he could not have gone to David and said, you know, David, I've sinned in your sight. I've chased the wrong dog in this fight. I've gone with the wrong horse. You know, all the things that haven't we done at times? You know, we chased after what our own heart said as opposed to what we know was right. But God always will take us back. So Ahithophel had an opportunity. He could have done what was right. He could have thrown himself at the mercy of David, and David may have accepted him back. But we kind of get to that at the end about the same correlation between him and Judas. What does Judas do? You know, once you hang yourself, you can't go back.
Yeah, and that's, you know, in the book there, if you remember, there's a chart in the book here. I got to put it up here on the screen. It kind of compares David and Jesus and a lot of the similarities. And one of the things is comparing Judas to Ahithophel, who committed suicide like Judas. And, you know, Judas too had, you know, the opportunity to repent and could have done things differently, but that wasn't the way it was. So that chart's on page 73 if you want to look at that. Some of the comparisons of what we're seeing here. We didn't really talk about here in verse 30 of chapter 15 about how David wept going up the Mount of Olives. But he was very, you know, very sad and very upset on this, you know, obviously when he's leaving the city. And he has his head covered, he's weeping, and we kind of pass over that, don't talk about it too much, but you know, this is a very emotional thing that's happening with David, and all that he's realizing all the consequences of some of the things that he had made in his bad decisions.
And it's his son.
Right.
It's family.
Exactly.
It's not like another dynasty from another, you know, division, the Medes or whoever. It's not like some of those people were coming against him. This
Right.
was within his own family, and that's very hard on the heart when your own family members are against you.
Sure. All right, so we're getting to the end of chapter 17 here, and we have that Hushai is able to they're able to get a message back to David. How do they get the message to David that they're going to chase after him? They're actually going to chase after him and try to kill him and defeat him.
Through the priest's sons.
Yeah, so just as David had said in an order, you know, he said, you know, these two priest sons, you know, be the messengers. So there's a little story in here about how, you know, they were hidden in a well because they had been seen, but they were able to escape from the guards and were able to continue on to send a message to David. Verse 21 says, men came up out of the well and went and told King David. They said to David, arise and go quickly over the water, for thus and so has Ahithophel counseled against you. And David arose, and all the people who were with him, and they crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, not one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. So they hadn't planned on crossing the Jordan, at least as of now. So they had to hurry again to get even further away from Jerusalem to try to protect protect themselves.
That's why Ahithophel's advice was really sound militarily.
Yeah, exactly.
We go after them right there.
And then verse 23 talks about the Ahithophel, how he hanged himself. And we see at the end here that David came to Mahanaim, whatever that is. How do you pronounce that? It's so it's way up here to the northeast, near the river Jabbok, and that's where they escaped to.
Which is interesting because that's where Ishbosheth had his capital. That's where he reigned from over the 10 tribes from the tribes of Israel.
Yeah.
He goes to the place where Ishbosheth reigned.
So it could all be tied together too, because of that. And at the end of chapter 17, we see that the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. So that's where we're going to end up today at the end of this chapter. And then we're going to go on into the results of Absalom and his rebellion and what happens here. And on Wednesday night, Gary will be talking about, we'll be going through chapters 18 through 20. And then what we'll see here is next Sunday, we finish the book, and next Sunday with the chapters 21 through 24, which is that epilogue that we had talked about at the very beginning of the class. So when you study for next Wednesday or next Sunday, take a look at chapters 21 through 24 and how that relate back even to as far back as Hannah's prayer that we talked about at the very beginning. And we'll kind of tie this all together before we tap into 1 Kings. Are there any questions or comments about any of this? All right, I'll let you out a couple minutes early today. Thanks.
Wow. Idolatry. True. Not true. John.
Hey, Aaron. Good to see you. The last spot yesterday, kind of like a good track race feeling. This sprint, yeah, it's like a lot of life. It's a different, it's interesting, and it's in a good, different types of pain and races. And it's never the same type of race. It's above your life.
I'm curious to know, I hope you find the answers and then share it.
The doctor said, he kind of said casually, oh, it's not like right now.